Welcome to all of our viewers out there in the audience. We are super excited to be with you all today. My name is Brady Piñero Walkinshaw. I'm the CEO of Grist, the national nonprofit environmental media organization, and we're really looking forward to this conversation with you all today. As I kick off, I just want to give a note of gratitude as we've relaunched the Grist brand over the course of this week. To our partner in that relaunch. It's a wonderful company called Nature's Logic, which works on pet food and uses 100% natural ingredients, no synthetic vitamins or minerals. And as I can attest, have been enjoying them in our own home. So thank you to Nature's Logic. So we are really looking forward to diving into a discussion about media and storytelling and climate today. And as I kick off, I thought I would just share a couple words about Grist, who we are, and what's in store for us. So Grist was an early pioneer in digital media. We were founded in 1999, and we have grown in both scale and kind of intent and strategy over the last several years, innovating in a lot of ways. And today we're a team of over 50 writers, journalists, editors, event creators, producers, that are dedicated to the core of what Grist is, which is a media organization dedicated to climate justice and solutions, and thinking about how we can help accelerate solving what is the biggest crisis that we face as humanity, which is getting to the other side of carbon, solving the planetary crisis in a way that is both equitable and just, and gets us to a future that is happier for humanity, healthier for the planet, and hopefully much more equitable on the other side. So this rebrand for Grist has been a real opportunity for us to center our work over the last several years in ideas of solution and justice. And that to us has been at the core of our journalism, of the work that my colleague Lisa is going to speak to around bringing together the leaders at the forefront of working toward a better and more just world. And furthermore, it's really at the core of who we become and who we are, and in a sense of what we think there needs to be more of in storytelling about the future of the planet. I'm based in Seattle. You'll see one of my colleagues, Lisa Garcia, who's extraordinary. She's the director of the Fix program. She previously helped run environmental justice in the Obama administration, and is a litigator by background, and runs what we call Grist Solutions Lab Fix, which she will speak to. And then also really delighted to have our executive editor, Nikhil Swaminathan, who's in Atlanta, who has been a partner to me over the last several years in helping and grow and build Grist and build out a really extraordinary editorial team, which is telling really extraordinary stories right now in various forms about getting to a better future. So I'm really excited to have the two of them with us. And as we go into conversation, I am going to start by asking a question to Nikhil, and just to start to ask him to reflect a bit on the role of media and climate change, and just how you've seen it evolve and change over the years, and how would you characterize the state of climate journalism and climate media coverage today?
I mean, today, I think I would call the state of climate coverage really strong. I think we're at this sort of moment of just amazingly deep coverage on the most existential threat to humanity. And I've seen climate journalism sort of rise to the moment recently, but over Grist's tenure of 20 plus years at this point, that cycle has sort of ebbed and flowed as the media industry has gotten used to this movement towards blogs, and the entire business model has been upended. So as recently as 2013, the New York Times, the Washington Post, a lot of major newspapers had shuttered their environment desks. And I think the LA Times at that point was the only major newspaper that had one. And Grist was sort of not necessarily alone, but part of a much smaller band of publications, including a lot of the science press, that were really writing a lot about climate change and what was going on, the impacts that we would see, the impacts that we were sort of already seeing. And right around the time the Trump administration came in, Washington Post once again had a climate and environment desk. The New York Times had a climate and environment desk. And I think given the fact that a lot of the people we're talking to on this call are very familiar with, climate and environmental issues, that a lot of the coverage over the last 4 years has been pretty dark. Environmental rollbacks were sort of the order of the day for the last 4 years. And we were all dealing with what was going on in the Trump administration versus what the scientists were telling us, the 2018 IPCC report. And then that was, followed shortly after by the National Climate Assessment. And we were just getting these signals and signs from the scientific community that was, we have a decade, we really, really need to move on this. And we saw ourselves, at least at the federal level, in the US, like moving in the opposite direction. And the media coverage really, really matched that. And that doom and gloom was really, really present. And Grist exists essentially as an antidote to that. For years, we spent time trying to, and we put our efforts into educating people about what was happening, like climate change is taking place, humans are responsible. And, I wouldn't say anything as ridiculous as mission accomplished, but the polling on belief in climate change and human culpability in climate change is quite high. It's around 70+%. But the belief that we can handle this, that we'll rise to the occasion and and avert the climate crisis, and the understanding that climate is another social justice issue along with racial justice, along with health justice, etc. Those two places are lagging. Human understanding and knowledge of those two, according to polls, people feel like it's hopeless and they don't see this as a justice issue. And Grist essentially now exists to attack those two issues and to bring up public opinion on those two issues. And like our stories are built around centering solutions and really looking at them really hard. We're not just hyping things, we're saying, will this work? And one of the ways we're saying, will this work, is, will this raise all boats? Like, is this going to leave small island nations out? Or is it going to leave vulnerable communities in the US and other parts of the world out? Like, are these solutions that will just help the rich? Electric cars, are they only for rich people? Like, how? These are the kinds of things that we're looking at now. And we're really just rising to the current moment.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on that, and I'm going to go over to our colleague Lisa, but Nikhil touched on something that we talk about a lot, which is that, over the past 20 years, you saw this really, we've built awareness that climate change is real, that it's happening, that it's anthropogenic. And in some respects, our question has now evolved to being one of, how do we solve the crisis? And then two, how do we solve it in a way that's equitable? And those sorts of, the solutions gap, as we call it, and kind of this equity or justice gap really lie at the core of, in a sense, kind of what our narrative strategy is and thinking about across our work. So we were so excited when Lisa Garcia joined Grist about 1.5 years ago, coming with a really deep seated background in leadership and environmental justice. And Lisa, maybe I could turn it to you, and maybe you could comment some on how low-income communities, communities of color, how you've seen those communities be impacted by climate change, but then more specifically, how you've seen it kind of show up in storytelling.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here and to be a part of this launch of the new website for Grist. So I would say that, I guess I could start with the executive order, the presidential executive order on environmental justice was signed in 1994. And so I feel like just giving you that piece of history will help people understand how the media has not covered environmental justice issues for so long. And that even though it's great to see climate justice at the forefront and equity being talked about, especially by President Biden and some of the executive orders that came out, that this is a movement that has been around for many, many years. And of course, it's been around for many years because of that environmental impact, because of the environmental degradation in low-income communities, communities of color, and in indigenous communities. And really the communities taking the lead on saying, this needs to stop, whether it's because of racism or not being thoughtful, or as Nikhil was saying, not thinking of the unintended consequences of what we're doing. You see the clusters of facility and the toxic pollution in many of these communities, and then also the health disparities in communities of color, especially where there's higher asthma rates, higher cancer rates. And so really the leaders on environmental justice have been around for many years. They've been leading this effort. And I would say that unfortunately, the media was not covering the work that they were doing in the communities, but that the communities and the leaders have always been focused on solutions and how to get to a place of equity, how to get to a place of improving quality of life. And so it's really great to see, fast forward now to see a lot of the attention on many of the people that have been working in the trenches, on the fence line communities that have been doing the work for decades almost. And so it's really great to see that now there's this effort. But I would say historically, one was the focus on the kind of white environmental movement, saving national parks. Obviously, we've all seen the polar bear as the face of some of the work in the environmental movement, and now beginning to really shift to more of the leaders of color that have been in this movement and leading the way on environmental justice.
I think that's a really powerful point, talking about solutions often emanating and coming from communities of color, coming from communities that are responding to direct impacts. And this is actually a good moment to put in a plug for something. Is we're teaming up with our friends at the New Press for a book that we have coming out with the New Press next month, which is called The World We Need, which is a book about community-based stories of environmental justice and a lot of the leaders behind them. But I think that to me brings in an interesting question I've been reflecting on a lot. Is we have seen a lot more attention on climate and environmental reporting over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Under the Trump administration, a lot of it was not hopeful for a set of self-evident reasons. That's evolved. There's been recent leadership that's really encouraging at the federal level. Nikhil, do you have thoughts about ways that solutions, when you look over the past 4 or 6 years, do you think there are ways that we could have emphasized solutions more in media at large, or any kind of reflections you have about the way coverage has played out over the last 4 years under Trump?
Yeah, I think it was hard, in media circles, we talk about something called the Trump bump. And it was this idea that if you wrote a story that was related to Donald Trump in some way, you would get more traffic, or you would get more attention. And so it was hard to look away from what was happening at the federal level, through the Department of Interior, through the EPA, et cetera. But if you were looking at the subnational level, especially cities, I know the Sierra Club had a massive initiative around cities committing to clean energy, 100% clean energy over a period of 10 to 20 years, at least 10 to 20 years. And, I live in Atlanta, and Atlanta committed to it. I think that there were amazing technological innovations in everything from size of nuclear reactors to carbon capture to improved solar and wind that brought the price down. And obviously we're still looking for, the big breakthrough in batteries, but even there was meaningful progress there. So there were plenty of solution stories. And as Lisa said, they existed at the community level, all the way up, just south of the federal level. And so, that's where we were looking, and we were, where we could, we were looking to international partners as well who are making more progress than the States. But it was hard, I can tell you, as a member of the media, to look away from what the Trump administration was doing. And, there was a lot of saying the quiet part out loud. And, it was just the scale at which, and we wrote a story about this, like our colleague Clayton Alder did this amazing story where he looked at all of the Trump rollbacks and split them up into a few subsections and tried to give readers a sense of what these rollbacks would mean, what the impacts would be by analogizing them to sort of things that people could grasp, get their hands around. And I mean, it was just immense. It was like this non-targeted strike because it was just so broad in the dismantling of the environmental regulatory state. And it was really, I think that journalism that was done about, tracking all the rollbacks and all that, that was immensely important. Like, we needed to know that stuff, but it was important for Grist to continue to try to surface solutions in a responsible and circumspect way, because, the only way to get through the crisis that we're facing is to keep talking about it, and positive stuff is the kind of stuff that you want to talk about with your family and friends. But also, like, we also need to have a sense that progress is being made and a little bit of hope to keep plugging away.
We're about to segue into a conversation about what we think the road is ahead and what we believe are some of the real, the future of how we ought to be framing from a storytelling, narrative, and journalism perspective, how we tell the story about the future of the planet. But before we do, I just had one more question for Lisa about her, more rooted in her background. And you worked a lot alongside a lot of environmental justice leaders over the years on a variety of different fights. And probably throughout those, these were people, these were leaders, individuals. In current Grist language, we call these fixers, people who are working toward a better future. But you worked with a lot of people who, we could call fixers. And I'm just curious if you saw them, struggling to get their stories told, or if you, did you feel like the media wasn't quick to pick up on a lot of these stories that were being told in communities? Maybe just to reflect a little bit on
that. Yes, definitely. I think that's one of the greatest things about Grist, and certainly the Fix program, that it's really featuring the people doing the work. But historically, I remember in the early 2000s working on things like a proliferation of waste facilities in certain communities in the New York area. And then right on top of that, an energy crisis. So of course, all the power plants had to be built in the same communities that had all the waste transfer stations and the chemical facilities. It just seemed to me that these were stories that had to get told. And it was really hard for us to get any daylight with the New York Times or any of the, back then radio and TV stations were a big thing to have a rally or press release go out to the mainstream media. And the stories were not being told. And so now, like I said, and in all fairness, some of the local, maybe like the Brooklyn Bee would tell the story because it was a really local issue. But that's why I think now the story is beginning to get out, and it's so important to tell the story of the people, the impact, and also the solutions. And that just was not happening just, 5-10 years ago, even though the environmental movement has been around, obviously, since the 60s and the 70s. So
it's a great segue. I mean, just to hand it over back to Nikhil, we want to talk a bit about where Grist is going from here, but then set that really within kind of this macro perspective of what we believe needs changing to get us to a place where we're really solving the climate crisis and the role that journalism has in that. So Nikhil, you've reflected a lot on editorial strategy, on editorial voice and tone. And I was wondering if you might just talk a bit about, going into the next year or two, what you see as with this idea of climate justice and solutions, what you see as editorial focus, how you've seen our tone evolve, and how we tell the story about the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about on the editorial side of Grist. And I think the idea, and I mentioned this earlier, but the idea that I really glommed onto was one that the Texas Tech University climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, has put forward, which is the most important individual action we can do to tackle climate change is to talk about it. And so our goal on Grist, on the editorial side of Grist, was really to provide the kindling for those conversations. And we used to do that in the before time, when we were a little bloggier and a little more irreverent. We used to do that in sort of more of a provocative, iconoclastic way. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to sharpen our points and really deliver like the sort of nuggets that you want to share with your family members and with your friends, and like the type of knowledge about climate that you would want to talk about at a bar, anywhere from like a bar to like the halls of Congress. And what we found is that the solution stories, even the ones that have a twist, there's this great story on the site today written by our colleague, Emily Pontecorvo. It's about a guy who I think lived in Austining, New York, which I think is where maybe Don Draper lived in Mad Men. So he was trying to make his house all electric, like get rid of his gas stove and other appliances, heating appliances. And he couldn't find a contractor that would do it for him. And that's kind of that's a Grist story. That's us saying, like, here's this person who's taking the initiative. This is like this electrify everything movement is like a big part of potentially how we get to the other side of, this climate crisis. And this is a limitation, like we're showing you a limitation where, contractors are potentially the biggest obstacle that you wouldn't think of to doing this necessary work. And that's exactly the type of story that's going to start conversations. And then I think the other part of that coin, which is really important to Grist, is, over the last, while we were talking about that period where, the New York Times and other newspapers had sunset their environmental desks. And then when their environmental desks came back, it was in that period that Grist really turned really hard towards the environmental justice beat. We brought on Brenton Mock, who's now at Bloomberg City Lab, and he wrote some really, really eye-opening pieces connecting, environmentalism and climate justice and climate action to race and to systemic racism and to policing and other things. And we realized that one of the strengths of our business model was that we would have the opportunity to go really deep on these kinds of stories. And so we launched an environmental justice desk in the last couple of years. We have 2 or 3 reporters working full time on, or 2 or 3 staffers working full time on environmental justice stories like this. The brand tagline changed, but it changed to meet what we were already doing. Especially on the editorial side, this is true. Like, we have shifted deliberately and intently over the last 4 or 5 years to move from a bloggier style of publication to a magazine style of publication. We look at our coverage through a number of different lenses. We've been doing this for 20 years. So we feel like the brand of Grist is authoritative. We want to be edgy and really find this like sort of sharp elbowed nuggets that are going to make you want to talk about issues related to climate and justice and solutions. You know, we want to retain that approachability. It's why our color scheme is still pretty welcoming, and our headlines are, we try to have, you know, fun within boundaries where we can. So really, the new site that you see at grist.org, the new branding that you see, it's really come to meet what we've been doing on editorial for like the last few years and where we've been moving to. And we really have this amazing opportunity now to take the long view on a lot of things, to serve really, really important analysis, to do more investigations, to do more enterprise stories, to do more high impact work. But, you know, we'll never fully shed our roots. So you're going to see some fun stuff from us from time to time, like the story that went on the site again this morning from Kate Yoder, our colleague Kate Yoder, who wrote about this new ad to encouraging the Biden administration to move forward with its infrastructure plan. And it's like a Chevy truck ad, but for climate construction jobs. So, you know, we will always, we're just evolving, and, you know, this is just an interesting moment to be able to mark that.
And maybe to take it, that's fabulous. And I was just going to put it back to Lisa for a moment. And then we have a bunch of great, I'm just seeing a bunch of great questions coming in from the audience that I want to make sure we're able to get to. But before we do, you know, Lisa, you head up a part within Grist, which is really focused on people and solutions. And I thought you might just talk about Fix and in this current moment, you know, post-election, you know, where you see the kind of power for impact and the work you're doing over the next year.
Yeah, great. So I think, like Nikhil has been saying, we've been kind of doing this work and telling the stories for a while, and so it's great to talk about Fix, which is Grist Solutions Lab, where we really showcase, as Brady was saying, the emerging leaders in the climate space and the climate justice space, and the people, once again, in the trenches already working on solutions and thinking about this in a positive way of saying, okay, yes, we have this problem, this existential problem of climate change, but we are going to lead the way for our community or for our state, or create the technology that then can be replicated and help in transportation, in agriculture. And so it's great, you know, if you go to the Fix website to really see the fixtures, as we call them. Every year we highlight 50 new emerging leaders. And so we'll be announcing Grist 50 2021, the new fixers next week. So stay tuned for that. But there's already wonderful stories of people doing the work already, leading the way, and not seeing this as dull, you know, doom and gloom and just sitting back and waiting. They're taking the reins and leading us. And so Fix is really the place where we do the storytelling of the fixers. And then we're also creating this network of fixers. And we're beginning to do more and more events around the work that the fixers have been doing. So it's great to kind of mix the storytelling with bringing together people to talk about the work that's being done, and then host events where people can come together and really talk about those solutions. So anyway, it's just wonderful to be launching this, but like Nikhil said, we've kind of already been doing this, and it's great for us at Fix to be able to complement the work of Grist Editorial, telling all the stories about climate and solutions, and then for Fix to really bring it back down to the people story of who is doing this and how to highlight their work. So we're having fun at Fix.
That's great. And I mean, look out, we are launching our sixth edition of the Grist 50, which, you know, we had over 1,000 nominations for this year. And it's inspiring to be able to kind of go through and call through just the really amazing work happening around this country from a solutions perspective to solving the climate crisis. So I'm going to go next. We had this question come in from someone in our YouTube audience, which I think is a great question and one that we reflect on a fair bit, which was, does greater awareness on a mass level create greater action? people still seem paralyzed to change behavior or to change or demand change. So kind of this question about, goes to the core Grist theory of change is we're building, we shifted away from just building awareness and trying to move toward helping people come to this belief that we can solve the crisis. So I wondered if Nikhil or Lisa, if either of you had thoughts on that question.
I was going to say, it's certainly, you said it, you called it our theory of change. It's certainly our bet. And as, we feel like Grist contributed to that change in the understanding of what climate change was and what was responsible for it. And we want to play a role in addressing the issue that this question gets to, which is how do we shake this sort of suspended animation and just fear of what's to come, and and move towards as a bigger and bigger and bigger group, meaningful climate action. And some people do it by organizing in the streets, and some people do it by working at the NRDC and things like that. And like the way that I do it is by writing about or editing stories and finding stories about progress, and finding stories about communities that are at risk of being left behind, and finding stories about things like, we have a big package coming out in 2 weeks about abandoned wells, the issue of abandoned wells. And what happens is like the market affects the oil and gas industry, let alone like government. And the hope is that by, like we've said, spurring more people to like make this a talking point, to talk about this the way that everybody last year was talking about the protests that were in the streets, the way that everybody was talking about, the pandemic, although that was hard not to talk about, that's what creates this push for change. And I think in some respects, Lisa can speak more to this from all the amazing work she's done up until this point. And then Brady, I know you have a stat, I think, at Recall about how culture change works. So, but that, I think the bedrock is like, this is our bet, is that pushing forward these conversations, like elevating these people, is our way of contributing to that culture change.
You want to chime in, Lisa?
Yeah, I would just add, just quickly, like, information is power, knowledge is power. There is power in the people. I don't know, that's like going way back, but really, when you think about it, if you think of a march that's leading down a street, and as people are like, hey, what are you doing? And then slowly you see people beginning to join that march. That's the way that I see it, that making sure that people have the right information about their communities, about their state, about their world, and getting people engaged with that information. And obviously through our storytelling, that's what we're hoping to do, is to inform more and more people, that they get on board and they understand that, maybe some of the health impacts in my community are because of this reason, or that maybe it's not so difficult for me to take the bus instead of having 5 cars for my whole family. Or anyway, there's just options. And I think that, you just see it through education and through information, that things over time have changed because of the power of the people and because of public awareness. And so whoever asked that question, don't give up, because the answer is yes, absolutely. That we will continue this advocacy and this hope to getting to solving the climate problems we have.
Yeah, and I guess the nuance, the question, the addition I'd make to that is that I think that what we've all come to realize is that just awareness as such just isn't enough. And I think that what we need to do is really galvanize us beyond that. And for me personally, it comes from a real belief that the future, as we solve the climate crisis, will be a better one. It'll be one where hopefully asthma rates are lower. Hopefully people have cleaner air and cleaner water, and hopefully there aren't toxic waste dumps or oil wells in low-income, poor, brown, black communities. Hopefully there aren't, hopefully we're not burning. This is a great story that Nikhil and the editorial team did around sugarcane burning in South Florida and the impact of that sugarcane burning on schools, and particularly schools with black kids, and the fact that they couldn't go outside when air quality was so bad. So I think that I think that awareness isn't enough. And the good news right now, which is inspiring, is that there are solutions that exist, which can be scaled, which are taking root, which are being replicated. And those can get us to this better future. And I think we're starting to see that, whether it's looking at technology or the environmental justice movement, or ways that cities are being reimagined and redesigned. So there are so many of these seeds of hope that I think are beginning to take root, and Grist is here telling that story, and to Lisa's point before about the people, lifting up the people behind that story, and connecting them. So that is a great question. I agree with whomever asked that awareness on its own isn't enough.
If you do a little bit of hope, we do put a newsletter every morning or every day called The Beacon, which is a sign of progress in the climate, towards solving climate crisis. And that's 5 days a week we're showing you that this work is being done. So if you need a little bit of hope, that's what that newsletter is designed for.
You can subscribe on our site. So I'm going to go to another question here that came in, and I'm going to pass to Lisa, which is, how do you think about covering a renewable energy transition and kind of the balance between a fast transition and a just transition? And are those things that you're thinking about in your work?
Yeah, I think the way that I would answer that is that it's not either or. I do think that sometimes when we think of what's the quick solution, it's not the right solution. And we've seen, as we were saying before, some of the unintended consequences of certain technology. And so I think the process of thinking about, how do we get to this clean energy future, the just transition movement, or, energy equity, all of those phrases really talk to this issue of make sure that everyone is at the table deciding on the solutions that work for either their community, their family, or, if it's a global effort, for their country, and that we're not just trying to find one fix and then try to, push it out as like the one quick fix for everybody, because that historically hasn't worked. And really, if we're talking about rising to the moment of justice and solutions and equity and racial equity, it has to be that we make sure everybody is in the room, all the smart people are in the room, making sure that we're thinking of all the potential outcomes of what we're talking about. And so clean energy or just transition is definitely the ultimate goal, but we have to be thoughtful and we have to be deliberate of how we get there, and really think of those kind of solutions that would make sense in a rural community, what would make sense in a coastal community, what would make sense maybe in India or in Venezuela and the United States. And so we just really need to take into consideration where people are and where do they need to go, what affordability, obviously jobs and health need to play into all of those conversations. And the great news is, as we've been talking about, people are taking action. There are solutions already being promoted. There's already solutions in place. And so when we talk about equity, just make sure that you're not saying it without real meat and the people behind that statement to get there. So I would say it's not an either or, like I said, it's a both and we can do the just transition thing and get there together.
So I'm gonna go to Nikhil with a closing question from the audience that is well suited to him. Nikhil, which you may not know, is actually a chemical engineer by background, so he could have he could have been working on oil wells and now he's reporting on them, which is a good thing. But this is a question that came from a Grist reader named Shannon, who's asking, how can scientists better engage with journalists and the public?
Oh, I think we saw over the last 4 years, scientists really burst out of the halls of academia and onto the streets during the March for Science. I think that the way that scientists communicate with the public has probably been transformed more in the last 4 years than it ever has before. And part of that was due to the Trump administration's sort of anti-science, position, but some of it was also due to the COVID epidemic. Public health officials, virologists, immunologists have been more present in our day-to-day discourse than ever before. Like, everybody knows who Tony Fauci is all of a sudden. And, I think that in some respects, like, presents an opportunity to climate scientists, because the next crisis, as we start to put COVID behind us, hopefully, it's the crisis that was here before, it's the crisis that'll be here after, is climate change. And, as journalists, we have an interesting relationship with scientists where, we see it as our role to translate their work for the public. And sometimes, there's a tension between how we want to describe it to lay people. There's a tension between accuracy and precision. We don't ever want to be wrong, but if a system works 99.9% the same way, we're going to say it works like this, and scientists are going to be like, but there's that 0.1% time when it's a little different. And so I think there's been a real effort among scientists to sharpen communication skills. I've seen it just in my career as a science journalist, that scientists have become much more talented at speaking to the public. We love being vessels for them, but there are also opportunities, through Twitter and social media and other platforms for them to talk directly to the public. But as far as we're concerned with the overall science on climate, that's pretty much decided, and we're focused on solutions and making sure everybody's, accounted for as we move forward.
I think that's a nice closing note. I'll just start by thanking both of you, both fabulous colleagues. This has been a great conversation. And I just also want to share that for all of you listening, we hope you'll continue to follow us at Grist, kind of follow our own evolution as we change the way that we tell the story and elevate the leaders and the people behind working toward a better future. I will be in, so thank you all for joining us and taking 45 minutes of your day today. Next Thursday, I'll be in conversation with White House climate advisor, many of whom you'll know, Gina McCarthy, is part of our event series, and Gina and I will be talking about the federal government's response over the next year to the climate crisis. You can join us there and several other conversations that we'll be producing in the months ahead. And you can register for those at grist.org/events. And thank you all so very much for your time. And we hope that you will join us in our work toward climate justice and solutions. Have a good rest of the day.